The last of the apocalyptic visions in the book of the prophet Daniel is traditionally referred to as the vision of the Hellenistic Wars. It is the longest and most detailed of the apocalyptic visions of Daniel, spanning chapters 10 through chapter 12 of the book. But as you can tell from its traditional title, it is a thinly veiled history from the Babylonian exile to the Antiochian persecution of the Jewish people under domination of the Seleucid Empire. Chapter 11, verse 5 to 45, talks a great deal about those empires that sprung from Alexander the Great, particularly the dynasty of Ptolemy out of Egypt and the Seleucid dynasties that eventually vied over that territory of the Jews, ending in the Seleucid dynasty dominating and leading to the persecution under King Antiochus. It's a very detailed series of visions, but without naming names and naming empires, anyone familiar with that history would recognize the history it portrays. By the 39th verse of chapter 11, the author catches up with his own period, the second half of the 2nd century BC. And it is from there that he projects again into the future in a prophecy given by Daniel from the point of the Babylonian exile that does not necessarily come true historically, but rather emphasizes God's intervention for his holy people. He speaks of God's liberation of Israel by its angelic protector, the archangel Michael, who we will see again in the book of Revelation as the great protector of the church. Here in Daniel, Michael is in effect the guardian angel, the angelic protector of the Jewish people in the midst of this persecution. And so with this long vision of the Hellenistic Wars, and indeed through all the visions of the book of Daniel, the author is trying to emphasize God's mastery over history. And through a theology of history, the author of Daniel helps his people to understand God has a purpose in what the people are going through, and in fact has had a purpose through the entire history of Israel, in particular from the exile to the persecution that will lead to the Maccabean revolt. The people, on the other hand, are challenged by the book of Daniel to remain faithful to their heritage as Jews, to their worship of their God, the one true God, who will eventually liberate them and reward them for their fidelity in God's good time. And the basic summary of the entire book of Daniel is found in chapter 12, verse 12, when Daniel gives a blessing on those who remain faithful, when he says, "Blessed is the man who has patience and perseveres." In Catholic Bibles, the book of the prophet Daniel concludes with 2 extra chapters, chapters 13 and 14, which were not originally a part of the Hebrew text of Daniel. But during the Hellenization period, as the Old Testament, including the book of the prophet Daniel, was translated into Greek, these stories were also translated into Greek and then included, tacked on to the end of the book of the prophet Daniel as kind of an appendix or epilogue. They're both important didactic stories, but I'm not going to address them in great detail because they are not in sync with the main body of the book of the prophet Daniel that we have been reviewing for this particular series. They are the stories in chapter 13 of Susanna, who was a virtuous woman, in which 2 corrupt judges sought to take advantage of her, and when she refused their advances, they framed her for adultery. After she's condemned, she prays to God, who sends Daniel, whose name means God is my judge. And after conducting his own investigation, Daniel exposes the corruption of the corrupt judges and the innocence of Susanna, and all people rejoice because God, who is that just judge, has vindicated an innocent person. Chapter 14 tells the story of Daniel and Bel and the dragon, 2 pagan gods that Daniel exposes as frauds in rather clever ways. But in doing so, he antagonizes the powers that be, who demand that he be thrown to the lion's den. And under pressure, the king allows him to be thrown to the lion's den. So it's a second telling of the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Some differences exist. He's in the lion's den for 7 days, during which the prophet Habakkuk comes to feed him. But in the end, the king sets him free, giving praise to God for having saved Daniel and vindicated his efforts against paganism. Both of them are important didactic stories, but they don't quite fit into the overall dynamic and structure of chapters 1 through 12 in the book of the prophet Daniel. But it is an example of the effect of the Hellenistic era and the process of history. After Alexander's conquest, the Hellenization of society, the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, and along with the prayers of the men in the fiery furnace in chapter 3, the stories of Susanna and of Bel and the dragon were incorporated into the Catholic canon, and what would eventually become the Catholic canon of the book of the prophet Daniel.